Masechet Menachot, Daf Mem Bet. In the Mishnah, all the way at the beginning of the Perek, we introduced the concept that in order for something to be pigul, it must be that one had improper intention to consume it outside the time for the entire duration of the necessary avodah. And when it comes to sprinkling, if it's out on the outside Mizbeach, then since one corner is sufficient according to Bet Hillel, it will become pigul if one has improper intention just for that one corner. However, when it comes to inner korbanot that are sprinkled on the inner mizbeach, all four corners are absolutely necessary in order to achieve atonement. Therefore, if one puts on three corners with proper intention and one with improper intention, so there the intention for pigul is only on one of the four. That's not on all of them. And so therefore, while it is pasul because you had some improper intention, it's not going to be karet because part of it was with proper intention and part without. In order to have karet, you have to have everything in that avodah, all the necessary sprinklings must be with intention for pigul. That is the opinion of Chachamim. On yesterday's daf, we cited a Mishnah in Masechet Menachot that said there's an argument about this. Chachamim, in fact, say that same principle, and it also applies to Korban Mincha, where you have to bring a kometz and a levona and put them both on the mizbeach, which is equivalent to putting blood for an animal sacrifice, burning the kometz and the levona. So, if you had pigul intention for the kometz and the levona, then chayav karet. But if you had pigul intention only for kometz or only for levona, then no karet. Same principle, according to Chachamim, the entire avodah has to be with pigul intention. However, Rabbi Meir disagrees, and he says, even if you had intention just for one, it is pigul and one is liable to karet. A simple reading of Rabbi Meir would seem to suggest that Rabbi Meir disagrees with the basic principle. And he says that if there is pigul intention even for part of an avodah, that makes it pigul. That seems to be what he's saying. However, Resh Lakish on yesterday's daf says not so. Rabbi Meir agrees with the basic principle that in order to become pigul, one has to have improper intention to consume it outside the time for the entirety. He agrees with that principle. The thing is that in the case of our Mishnah and here, we look at what he had intention for first. If the first activity he did was with improper intention to be outside the time, and then the next things that he did were without any specific intention, then we assume that what he intended for at first what continues to the next items. And that's how Rabbi Meir, can explain this Mishnah, that if at first he did something with proper intention, and at the end he did something with improper intention, well, that's only partial improper intention, and therefore no karet. Rabbi Meir would agree with this Mishnah. However, if it's the other way around, if he started off with improper intention and then had no specific intention for the rest of them, we assume that pigul intention at the beginning continues through the end, and therefore it's considered the same as having pigul intention all the way through. That was Resh Lakish's understanding of Rabbi Meir. And now we are going to object to that understanding. When do we say that something will become pigul even if one only does the first sprinkling with pigul intention? That's only for blood that is placed on the outside mizbeach, because on the outside mizbeach you only need one placement of blood, and therefore it will become pigul even with just that first placement of blood. Aval damim anitanin al mizbeach hapinimi. However, any blood that needs to be placed on the inner mizbeach, then the situation will be different. Now it's going to give some examples. Kigon, 43 shel Yom Kippurim. On Yom Kippur, the bull and the sa'ir of Yom Kippur have 43 sprinklings inside, both of them together. How so? You take the bull, and that is sprinkled in the Kodesh Kodashim, achat lemala v'sheva lemata. All the sprinklings are like that, so 1 above and 7 below, that's 8 altogether. So the bull has 8 sprinklings in the Kodesh Kodashim. Sa'ir also, same 8. So that's already 16. Then both of those are sprinkled 8 times towards the curtain. And so that's another 16. That gives us 32. And then it's sprinkled, dabbed on the 4 corners of the Mizbeach and 7 times in the middle, which is another 11. So that's 32 plus 11. There you go. 43 on Yom Kippur. Ve'achad asar shel par kohen Mashiach ve'achad asar shel par helem davar shel sibur. Both of these korban hatats for the Kohen Gadol and for communal offering, when the judges make a mistake, are brought inside and are sprinkled 7 times towards the hechal, towards the parochet, and 4 times on each of the corners of the mizbach penimi. Pigel ben barishona, ben basheniya, ben bashilishit. Rabbi Meir omer pigul v'chayvin alav karet. Hachamim omrim en bo karet ad sheyifagel b'chol hamatir. When it comes to any of these that are in the inner mizbeach, if one had pigul intention, doesn't matter whether it was for the first corner or the second corner or the third corner, doesn't matter any one of them, according to the Rabbi Meir, it becomes pigul. That would seem to mean that any one of them, even if it was the second one or the third one, that means if he had proper intention for the first one, but pigul intention for the second, it would become pigul for Rabbi Meir. So that sounds like Rabbi Meir disagrees with the entire principle of Chachamim, and he thinks partial intention for part of the avodah makes it pigul. Because if he thought that it has to do with the first one, then we continue the intention for the first one, well, that wouldn't work here, because if the first one was proper intention and the second one wasn't, he still says pigul and one is liable to karet. So that's the challenge against Resh Lakish. Let's just finish. Hachamim say, no, there's no karet until he has pigul intention for all of the action that will make it permitted. And all 4 corners are required in order to achieve atonement. And therefore, they disagree with Rabbi Meir. So here's the language of the question. Katane miha pigel ben barishona ben basheniya ben bashilishit ufalig. And Rabbi Meir said that it doesn't matter if he had intention for pigul. Doesn't matter if it was during the first one or the second one or the third one. Rabbi Meir disagrees with Chachamim and says it is pigul. So that means that Rabbi Meir is not only continuing the intention of the first one, but it seems to say that improper intention, even for part of an avodah, makes it pigul. Good question. Amar Rav Yitzchak bar Avin. Hacha b'maiskinan kigon shepigel b'shchita techad matir hu. Rav Yitzchak bar Avin says no. This baraita here is talking about a somewhat complicated case of someone takes a bull, you did shechita, you collected the blood, and you brought it. Let's say shechita for Kohen Gadol or any of them that we brought above, and so you bring it into the kodesh, and you put it on one corner. But then, before you got a chance to put it on the second corner, the whole thing spills. All of it spills on the floor. He has no more blood. What is he going to do? He can continue where he left off, but he has to get another animal and get the blood. So he goes, gets another animal, does shechita, takes that blood, and then continues where he left off on the second one. If you have such a case, and he had pigul intention during the shechita of that second animal, that's what this baraita means, that he had pigul, whether for the first one or for the second one. For the second one is a case where the first one, he did everything with proper intention, no problem, but then spilled the blood. He goes and gets a second par, does shechita with intention of pigul. Since that itself is an entire avodah, even though it will be used only for the second sprinkling and not for the first, that's where the Rabbi Meir is talking about when he says that is pigul. Okay, it's not so easy to fit all this in to the wording of the baraita, but that's Rav Yitzchak bar Avin's answer. Ihachi ma'itad Rabbanan, but now we challenge that. If so, if that's the case, what would be the reasoning of Rabbanan who say that one is not liable? En bo karet. Well, according to Rabbanan, you just did a whole shechita with intention of pigul. Well, shechita is its own avodah, it's a whole avodah, and therefore, if you did shechita of one of the parim with intention of pigul, then it should be in fact, karet, according to them as well. Amar Rava, man chachamim Rabbi Eliezer he. Rava says, I can defend the interpretation of Rav Yitzchak bar Avin of this baraita, that we're talking about a case where he sprinkled, let's say 3 of them, everything just fine, and then spilled all the blood on the floor, and then went back and got another pod and had intention of pigul when he was doing shechita on that pod. And according to Chachamim, there would not be karet. When they say, why not? But he did a whole shechita with pigul intention. I'll tell you why. Because Chachamim there is actually the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. Some say Rabbi Elazar here, who says in a Mishnah later on, Ditnan, HaKometz v'halebona v'haketoret u'minchat kohanim u'minchat kohen mashiach u'minchat nesachim shehikri me'achat mehen kazayit bachutz chayav v'Rabbi Eliezer poter ad sheyakriv et kulan. This Mishnah is talking about mincha offerings where, in order to fulfill your obligation of the mincha offering, you have to burn all of this item. So for a regular korban mincha, the kohen takes a kometz and he has to burn all of that kometz and all of the levona on the mizbeach. For ketoret, you're supposed to burn all of it. For a mincha that a kohen brings, you have to burn all of it. For when someone else brings it, then he burns the kometz and the kohen eats the rest. But if a kohen brings it, he has to burn all of the mincha, all of the flour, and kohen mashiach, kohen gadol, brings a daily offering, mincha offering, and that is all burnt, and also the mincha offerings that are brought together with other korbanot of animal korbanot. In these cases, one is supposed to burn all of it on the mizbeach. However, what if, and therefore, if he would take all of it and burn it outside of the Bet HaMikdash, then he certainly would be liable for offering a korban outside of the Mikdash. Here's the question: what if he burns only one kezayit outside of the mikdash? According to Chachamim, he is still liable. And you see that according to Chachamim, even though in order to fulfill the korban properly, he would have to burn all of the flour on the mizbeach. And so you might think that so too, he would have to burn all of it outside in order to be liable for burning a korban outside. But Chachamim say not so. He's considering part like the entire thing. A kezayit is a substantial part, and that is enough to be considered like the whole rest of it. And so therefore, this could fit with Rabbi Meir's opinion in the Baraita above, that although he's doing shechita, the whole shechita, is only one thing to do in shechita, he has pigul intention. Even though this shechita animal is going to be used, the blood will be used only for one corner, but nevertheless we consider this part as an entire thing, and therefore that will make it pigul, because he does this entire avodah with pigul intention. And so Rabbi Meir would fit together with the logic of Chachamim here. But that leaves Rabbi Eliezer, whose logic will fit with Chachamim in the Baraita above. Rabbi Eliezer says, in order to be liable for offering a korban outside of the Mikdash, you have to burn all of the flour offering outside the Mikdash. Because just like you have to burn all of it in the Mikdash to fulfill your obligation, so too you'll have to burn all of it outside in order to be liable. So too here, you're doing shechita and you're going to use this blood only for one corner. Well, in that case, that's not the action, because the action is dependent on all four corners. You need all four corners, and therefore, if you were using 4 different animals, one for each corner, you would have to have improper intention for all 4 shechitas in order for that to become pigul. Eventually, because in other words, you don't look at part as a whole, and that this part, well, you're doing an avodah, we're going to consider that avodah as a whole thing. No, Rabbi Eliezer does not do that. He says a kezayit is not like a whole, and so too, we're making an analogy. It's a kind of a loose analogy, but that's the logic here, that Rabbi Eliezer, we presume, would say that even if you have improper intention for shechita, that's a whole shechita of a whole animal, because that animal is only being used for one or not all of the corners, therefore it is not pigul, it is not karet. And so Rava says, see, I can explain the Chachamim in our Baraita according to this interpretation. But there's a problem. It doesn't work. Rava tried himself to answer this, but V'hamar Rava himself says, Umodeh Rabbi Eliezer b'damim ditnan. Rabbi Eliezer v'Rabbi Shimon omrim mimakom shepasak misham hu matchil. Rava said that even Rabbi Eliezer, who says that regarding a meal offering, you have to, if you're supposed to burn all of it and you do a part of it outside, not liable. You have to do all of it outside. But when it comes to blood offerings, that's not so. If you have a blood offering, and even if you just do part of a blood offering outside of the mikdash, that is already liable. How do you know that Rabbi Eliezer says that? Because in a Mishnah, it talks about what happens if you have a bull or a goat of Yom Kippur and it spills. In the middle, you're doing some sprinkling. You do, 1, 2, 3 out of 7, and then it spills. So the other sages say you got to go back to the beginning. It doesn't count. Doing one sprinkling is not in and of itself a whole thing. It's not sufficient, and therefore, if it spills, you have to start over again. The counting. However, to be Eliezer and Rabbi Shimon say, you sprinkled 1, 2, 3, and then it spilled. Go get more blood from another pot and continue where you left off. So you see, according to them, that each sprinkling is its own entity, and therefore they would also say that if you sprinkled even a little bit of blood outside, not even all the blood that you're supposed to sprinkle, still one would be liable. And so therefore here also, Rabbi Eliezer would say, okay, you did 3 properly and then all the blood spilled. And there you have 1 left, you go get another pot. You do the shechita with improper intention, that's going to be pigul also, according to Rabbi Eliezer, because that's for 1 sprinkling, but 1 sprinkling they consider to be a whole act in and of itself, and therefore that shechita is a whole avodah in and of itself. And therefore, this answer does not fit, and so we reject it altogether, and we are looking for another way to defend Resh Lakish's interpretation of this baraita. How could this baraita say that according to the Bimeir, it doesn't matter if you do the first or the second or the third, and it doesn't matter which order, then still it is pigul, even if the first one was okay and the second one wasn't. Ela amar Rava, kegon shepigel barishona v'shatak b'sheniya v'chazar upigel b'shelishit. Rava says this baraita is talking about a case not where you had pigul, you had proper intention with the first one, and then improper intention after that, because then it would not be pigul. Because if you start off with proper intention, then even if the rest are with pigul intention, that's only part. With part improper intention, and according to the Shakish, Bimir agrees that it has to be all improper intention. Rather, Rava says when it says this or this or this, it's talking about a case as follows: you had pigul intention for this first sprinkling of the first corner, and then no specific intention for the second one, so we can assume that he's continuing improper intention. And then for the third one, he has specific intention. This one is going to be, so I will consume it outside of the time. And so now, in this case, you might think what? Mahudetema isal kadatach al dat rishonahu mihadar pigule bashilishit lamali kamashmalan. You might have thought in this case, this is why Rava thinks that the Baraita has to say this case, you might have thought that if he was following through, continuing his intention from the first one, and then the first sprinkling he thought of pigul intention, and the second one he had no specific intention, and so he's following through and doing it the same. But then why would he repeat in the third one and say, oh, the third one, this is for pigul intention? By revealing on the third one that that's for pigul intention, it seems to indicate, you might argue, that the second one was specifically not for pigul intention, and therefore the whole thing would not be chayav karet. And therefore, kamash malan, this baraita comes to teach me that even so, according to the Bi Meir, we don't say that the third one reveals, the third pigul intention reveals that the second one was not pigul intention. No, we assume that the first one was pigul intention, that continued in the second, and for some reason or another, he wanted to say it again for the third one, and therefore it's continuous pigul intention for all of them, and therefore it is liable to karet. That's the case according to Rava. Matkif la Rav Asher, midi shatakatane. Rav Asher says it doesn't fit well with the words of the Braita. Does it say he was quiet in the second one? Doesn't say that. It says the first one or the second one or the third one. Ela amar Rav Asher. Rav Asher says this Braita is talking about a case where he had specific intention for pigul on the first sprinkling and the second one and the third one. He said again, this is for outside the time, but for the fourth one, he didn't say anything at all. And in fact, in the Braita, it doesn't talk about the fourth one. So this would explain why it doesn't talk about the fourth one. And what's the chidush here? The chidush is, if you would say the principle, which Resh Lakish does say this principle on behalf of Rabbi Meir, that when whatever you do for the first thing, we assume that he continues the same intention for the rest of it, since that's the principle, and we could assume that. But in this case, he had specific intention for the first and second and third, but then not for the fourth. But if he knows that we continue the intention from the first, miadar pigule bechol chada v'chada lamali. Why did he bother having specific intention for the second and the third? He would just say for the first one, this is for pigul intention. And then, second, third, and fourth would all be included from the fact that he said for each one, second one is pigul, third one is pigul. Doesn't that mean that he wanted those to be pigul, and that's why he said it specifically each for each one? But the fourth one, where he'd left it out and didn't say anything, maybe that means that one was not pigul intention. Kamash malan. Therefore, according to Rav Asher, this Baraita had to teach this rule that the Rabbi Meir would apply the continuing intent rule, even in this case where he had specific improper intention for the first three and not the fourth. Vaha ben katane kashya. Yeah, but the Gemara says that really doesn't fit the wording of the Braita. You can't say this first and second and third because it says ben. Whether the first or the second or the third, that clearly means or, and therefore we leave that interpretation with a question. Amar Mor, Rabbi Meir Omer, Pigul v'chayabin alav karet. Now we're going to go back and ask a question about the opinion of Rabbi Meir, who says that if one has pigul intention just for the first corner and then the rest of them, he has no specific intention, nevertheless, it is considered pigul and it is one when one is liable to karet. We ask, we have a general rule that you're not going to get karet until you offer all of the things that you need to offer in order to make it permitted. In other words, in this case, all four corners. Damar mor, karsat kasher ka karsat pasul. Just as you need to make it in a kosher sacrifice by making all four corners, so too, in order to make it pigul, you do have to sprinkle blood on all four corners. The discussion between Meir and Chamim is whether you need pigul intention specifically on all four corners or even on just some of them, but you have to actually put blood on all four corners. And so we learned in that statement, Marasat kasher ad shikrivu kol matirav, afarasat pasul ad shikrivu kol matirav. Just like making it acceptable in a kosher way, you have to sacrifice all of the things that are required to sacrifice to atone. So too, to make it acceptable to pasul. It's a funny term. Hasat pasul. Hasat means it's acceptable. That means it's a good thing. But this is acceptable for being pigul, because that's the law of pigul. It's only pigul if that's the only problem. So, in order for it to be pigul and chayav karet, you have to make sure to perform all of the sprinklings, which is all four, in an inner mizbeach korban. Here's the question: Veha kevan dechashi be bifnim pesula keman de la ade dame ki hadar made bahechal maya bealma hu deka ade. And in this case, let's say it's a pod for Yom Kippur. When he goes into the Kodesh Kodashim and he has in mind pigul, so that sprinkling is obviously not valid. So it's as if he didn't sprinkle blood. And then when he takes that blood out to the sanctuary part to put it onto the parochet and onto the mizbeach, he's sprinkling just water, because by having improper intention in the first one, now the rest of it is already no good. And this is especially true for the Rabbi Meir, because the Rabbi Meir says even pigul for thought for one of them, for the first one, is already sufficient to make the whole whole thing pigul chayav karet. Therefore, even from that point, the rest of what he's going to sprinkle is just water. So if he's then, in that case, if he's just sprinkling water, he didn't sprinkle all the sprinkles necessary, and therefore it should not be pigul. That's the challenge. Amar Rabba, mashkachalda be'arba'a parim or be'arba'a seirim. Rabba says, we can construct a case where it would be liable for the bimeir if a case where you use 4 different bulls and 4 different seirim. In other words, every time you're going to sprinkle on one corner, you get another bull. So 1 bull for the first corner. Now you sprinkle that. Okay, good. But now the blood becomes no good because now it's like water because it's pigul. All right, you know what? Go get another bull, do shechita, receive that, do the second one. So you did the second one. Now that blood becomes no good because it's pigul. So now you go do a third one and a fourth. Get 4 different bulls or 4 different goats for each corner of the mizbeach, and that way you will have fulfilled doing all 4 sprinklings. And although one had intention for pigul just for the first one, but you did all the rest of the sprinklings, that's how you could construct such a case, which would be quite a lot of work and a lot of bulls. So Rava says a simpler answer. Rava Amar, afilu tema bepar echad v'seir echad lefigulo meraseh. Rava says, no, you could talk about 1 pod and 1 sa'ir, and these sprinklings that you're going to do with that blood is okay for pigul. In other words, although you're right, once you do have pigul intention for the first corner, now that it's improper, it's going to be pasul for the rest of the corners if you wanted to make it kosher. But we're not trying to make it kosher, we're trying to make it pigul. So if that blood is good enough to be considered blood for the purpose of having all the corners done in a pigul way. And so therefore that's a simpler answer. Yes, pigul requires that it all be done, that all the corners be done, but it doesn't have to be done in a kosher way, in a pigul way. So this is sufficiently called sprinkling in all 4 corners for the purposes of making it pigul. Now, back to the Braita. Arba'im v'shalosh. It said that on Yom Kippur, we sprinkle 43 times, and we just calculated that above. V'hatanya, arba'im v'sheva. But there's another Braita that on Yom Kippur, we sprinkle blood 47 times. So which one is it? And the answer is that 43 is according to the opinion that we mix together the blood when we are putting it on the 4 corners. You take the bull and the goat, although they're sprinkled separately in the Kodesh Kodashim, that's 16 times, and it's also sprinkled separately, 8 and 8, 8 for the Sayyid, 8 for the Par, onto the Parochet, so that's another 16, that's 32. But then, when you're going to sprinkle them on the inner altar, then you mix them all together, and then that's another 7 and 4. Onto the altar and the 4 corners, and the middle of it, 4 corners is 4, and the middle of it is 7, and that's the pod and the sayir together, so it's another 11. That makes 32 plus 11 is 43. But there is another opinion that says that we do not combine them together when we put it on the corners, and therefore, for the corners, you're going to do pod on the corners and a sa'ir on the corners. That adds another 4. Then there you get 47. Wait, there's yet another Braita that says 48. So where would be the extra one? The 48 would be according to the opinion that says that taking the remainder of the blood and pouring it onto the base of the mizbeach is required. If that's required, that's another blood service, another dabbing, sprinkling, but in this case pouring. Whereas that's B48. The other opinion that says that it's dispensable. You're supposed to. It's a mitzvah to put it onto the base, but if you didn't do it, you still achieved atonement. So since that's not a necessary one, it's not counted in the count, and therefore it's only 47. The Gemara next will ask another question against Resh Lakish's interpretation of Rabbi Meir, and this is from a Baraita. When do we say that pigul intention for a korban mincha will make someone liable to karet? Well, that's if he has pigul intention during the kmitza, which is one standalone service, putting it into kli, a second standalone service, or hiluch, the third standalone service. So that's any one of these because that's the whole service, and you had pigul intention, therefore chayav karet. אבל בא לו להקטרה, נתן את הקומץ במחשבה ואת הלבונה בשתיקה, או שנתן את הקומץ בשתיקה ואת הלבונה במחשבה. רבי מאיר אומר, פיגול וחייבין עליו כרת. חכמים אומרים, אין בו כרת עד שיפגל בכל המתיר. When it comes to the הקטרה, the last service, if he did only half with improper intention. And it gives two examples. If he burnt the komets with improper intention to consume it outside the time, and then he did the levona and was quiet, this part of it would be okay, according to Resh Lakish's interpretation of Rabbi Meir, which was that whatever intention you start with, we assume that you continue. And he had improper intention for the first thing that he burned, and therefore he was quiet for the second one, so we assume that he still had improper intention and therefore would be liable. That makes sense. The problem is the second case, or that he put the komets first and was quiet, didn't have any intention specifically, and then after that did the levona b'machshava. Rabbi Meir says in that case it is pigul and one is liable to karet. Chachamim say no, there's no karet because you have to have pigul intention for all of the steps that are part of that action that's needed to make it necessary. Here's the question: Katani miha et hakomes b'shtika v'et lebona machshava ufaleg. So here the question is from the line that says you put the komets first b'shtika, and then you did the levona with improper intention, and yet the Rabbi Meir says that is he disagrees with Chachamim and says it is liable to karet. Why? He had the bad intention second, so you can't say he's continuing. Oh, why don't we read it as he natan at komets bishtika. He did indeed. He put the komets on the fire without intention, but that was done after the levona b'machshava. So just add in the words that he had already done the levona with improper intention. So by adding that in, we're kind of switching around the order. But that really is not a good reading. Chada dehainu resha. If so, that would be the same basic case as a resha. Because the Resha said he did the machshava first and then shtika. So now you're saying this is also machshava first and then the shtika. So that's the same thing. I mean, it doesn't really matter if he did the komets first or the levona first. The point is that he did the machshava first, and so that's the same case as the Resha. So why the repetition? And furthermore, ve'od hatanya ve'achar kach kashya. Furthermore, there's another version of this braita that says specifically achar kach. First, he put the komets of shtika, and only then he put the levona with machshava. And so, therefore, this is a final difficulty against Rabbi Resh Lakish. And it seems actually that, according to Rabbi Meir, he would disagree with Chachamim more fundamentally and say that if something is pigul, even if he had pigul intention, only for part of the avodah service. Baruch Adonai le'olam, amen ve'amen.